The town of San Pedro had been bought 3 times over. The land, the water rights, the mercantile license, and finally, the silence of every man who might have once thought to object. The man who owned all of it had paid for each piece methodically, the way a collector acquires things he intends to keep forever. His name was Harlan Bledsoe, and he was not the kind of rich that came from Yunshi. He had built his fortune the way men built fences around land they intended to claim, one post at a time, driven deep enough that no storm would move them. He had heard about the stranger 3 weeks before the stranger ever arrived. The stories traveled the way dust travels in West Texas, kicked up by nothing and arriving everywhere at once. A man who walked into towns from the desert. A man who left towns the same way, except with fewer men standing in them than when he entered. Harlan Bledsoe collected information the way he collected everything else, and what he collected about the Nameless Gunslinger was this: no one had ever made him kneel. No one had ever put him on his knees in front of other men and shown the world that he was just another man. Harlan had never lost a gamble in his life. He intended to keep that record intact, and so he set the board the way wealthy men learn to set boards when they want something done without having to touch the doing of it themselves. The stranger arrived in San Pedro on a Tuesday. The sun was already high and cruel by the time he reached the edge of town, and the horses at the water trough lifted their heads at the same moment, ears pinned flat against the silence. He walked a gray gelding with the patience of a man who had learned that getting there slowly was better than not getting there at all. He wore a black duster that had been worn soft by years of wind and sun. His hat was broad, and his face beneath it was a face that had stopped keeping count of its own miles. The town saw him come. That was the first mistake anyone made around him. They saw him, and they watched, and the watching was a kind of invitation. Harlan Bledsoe had prepared the stage with the precision of a man who understood that theater required rehearsal. 3 of his best men were already waiting at the saloon when the stranger rode in. Not hired killers. Harlan had learned decades ago that killing was easy and clean and left no lasting impression. What he wanted was something better than death. He wanted the story. The plan was elegant in the way that only cruelty refined by money could become elegant. The 3 men would provoke the stranger with words first. Harlan had written the words himself over breakfast that morning, which he ate alone at a table that seated 24, but had never held more than himself and his gold pocket watch. The words were designed to strip a man of the last cloth of dignity a human being possesses, which was not his body and not his property, but his name. If a man had no name, he had nothing that could be taken. But if a man was known, even secretly, even only by himself, then that name could be spoken aloud in front of witnesses, and the speaking would be a kind of killing. The stranger's horse stopped in front of the saloon. He dismounted slowly. He tied the reins to the post with a knot that was not showy but was also not simple. The kind of knot a man ties when he expects trouble and wants to be able to leave quickly. Then he looked up at the 3 men standing on the porch, and he saw them the way a man sees weather. He did not read their intentions. He simply waited for it to arrive. The first man spoke. He said words that were not loud but were meant to be heard by everyone on the street, which at that hour was most of the town. The words accused the stranger of being a coward. They accused him of running from towns he had ruined. They accused him of being nothing more than a drifter, with a gun he was too afraid to use except against men who could not fight back. The second man laughed in the right places. The third man added details that were not true, but were spoken with the confidence of men who had been paid to believe them. The stranger listened. He listened the way a potter listens to clay, not arguing with it, but simply waiting for it to tell him what it wanted to become. When the 3 men finished, the street was quiet. The townspeople had stopped moving. They had stopped breathing, some of them, the way prey animals freeze when they sense the presence of something they cannot outrun. The stranger spoke one sentence. He said, "You are all 3 free to walk away from this." The first man interpreted this as fear. The second man interpreted it as pride. The third man, who was older than the other 2 and had been in more situations where the math did not favor him, interpreted it as something else entirely. He looked at the stranger's hands and saw that they were not moving, and that the stillness of them was the stillness of a man who had already calculated every distance and every draw and every way the next 10 seconds could unfold. The third man took one step back. The first man did not take a step back. He reached for his gun. The stranger's draw was not fast in the way that fast is usually measured. It was fast in the way that a door closing is fast. It was inevitable and final, and it happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. And when it was over, the first man was on the porch with his hand open and his gun 8 feet away, and his face pressed against the wooden boards by the barrel of the stranger's Colt. The second man had not yet finished processing what he had seen. He reached for his gun. The stranger turned and shot the gun out of his hand with a single shot that removed the trigger guard and left the man holding a ruined weapon and a silence that was louder than any scream. The third man, who had stepped back, was already walking away. He did not run. He walked, and he did not look back, and no one in that town ever saw him again, which was the kind of death that did not require a body. The stranger holstered his weapon. He untied his horse. He mounted and turned north, away from the saloon, away from the street, away from the two men who were still on the porch and the one who was already gone. But Harlan Bledsoe had not spent 40 years accumulating the kind of wealth that buys silence without learning how to purchase the kind of men who do not know when to stop. He had 4 more men waiting at the north end of town. He had told them what to do with words. He had not told them what to do with the stranger. The words were enough. The words were always enough. The 4 men appeared at the well where the stranger had stopped to water his horse. They came from 4 different directions at once, not coordinated but arranged, and they began to speak before they were close enough for the words to carry as anything but a public announcement. They spoke the way Harlan had instructed them to speak, which was the way men speak when they are trying to make an example of someone they have already decided is an example, and not a man. They said his name. All 4 of them said his name, each one louder than the last, and the name was not the name the stranger used, and it was not the name the townspeople had given him. It was a name that belonged to a woman named Rosario in El Paso, a woman who had held his arm in the street 31 years before, and who had named her son Wade because the stranger had looked at her and said 2 words that she had chosen to believe. They said that name. They said it in front of the townspeople who had gathered, in front of the women who were drawing water and the men who had come to see what the noise was about, in front of anyone who could hear, and they said it not once but 4 times, each repetition another layer of humiliation laid on top of the last. The stranger's hands stopped moving on the reins. The horses knew it before the men did. The horses had always known. Even before he entered a town, before the first man looked up and the first woman pulled her child closer, the horses felt him coming. And now 4 horses stood perfectly still, and 4 men on their backs did not understand why their animals had gone rigid with a fear that made no logical sense. The stranger turned his horse slowly. He looked at the 4 men and he saw them the way a man sees a wound that has been opened when it should have been allowed to heal on its own. He did not speak. He did not draw. He simply waited. And the waiting was worse than any threat he could have made. Because waiting was what a predator does before it decides whether to eat or to walk away. One of the 4 men was the third man from the saloon, the one who had stepped back and walked away, and who should not have been there at all. Harlan had sent a rider after him at noon that same day, with an offer that was not money. It was a threat. The threat was simple. He would tell the towns in the territory what the third man had done in a town called Marfa 2 years before, a thing the third man had believed was buried and private and beyond the reach of any man who had not been there. The third man came back. He came back because he had no choice. And now he sat on his horse in front of the stranger and knew that whatever happened next, he would not survive it. Not because the stranger would kill him, though he might. He would not survive it, because the stranger had seen him come back, and had seen the reason why. And the reason was a thing the third man could never put back inside the box where he had kept it. The stranger spoke. He said, "You know what you did." The third man said nothing. There was nothing to say. The stranger said, "You will carry this now. It is yours." Then he turned his horse again and rode north, and no one followed him. The town of San Pedro was quiet for the rest of the afternoon. The people went back to their businesses, their water drawing, their conversations that were smaller and safer than the conversations they had been having an hour before. Harlan Bledsoe, watching from the window of his office on the 2nd floor of the Mercantile, felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt uncertain, not afraid. Harlan Bledsoe did not do fear. But uncertainty was different, and it sat in his chest the way a stone sits at the bottom of a well, and he did not know how deep the well was or what was at the bottom of it. He had accomplished what he set out to accomplish. The stranger had been publicly named. The town had heard it. The story would not be about the man who walked into San Pedro from the desert and left 3 men diminished and 1 man gone. The story would be about the name. That was what Harlan wanted. That was what he had paid for. The humiliation was complete, and it had cost him less than a new horse and less than a quarter of the price of silence in one of his smaller towns. He sat at his desk and he poured himself a drink and he watched the sun move across the sky the way the sun moves in West Texas in June, which is to say it moved like it was angry about something and was going to take its time cooling down. He drank his whiskey and he thought about the stranger and the name and the way the third man had looked when he rode back into town, which was the way a dog looks when it has been called back to heel by a voice it cannot refuse. He did not notice the sun moving lower until it was already low. The knock on his door came at the same moment the light turned gold. It was his man, the one who managed the property and the accounts and the things that required a signature and not a conscience. The man looked pale. He said, "He is back." Harlan set down his glass. He said, "Who?" The man said, "The stranger." Harlan stood up. He walked to the window and looked down into the street and saw the stranger on his gray gelding, sitting perfectly still in front of the mercantile, and the street was empty because the street emptied the moment he appeared. The stranger was not pointing his gun at anyone. He was not speaking. He was simply there, and the simple presence of him in a place where he had already been once that day was a statement that did not require words. Harlan descended the stairs. He crossed the mercantile floor and opened the door and stepped onto the porch and stood in the last light of the sun and looked up at the man on the horse. The stranger did not look down. He looked at the horizon, the way he always looked at the horizon, as if the horizon was the only thing in the world that had ever been worth his full attention. Harlan said, "You are back." The stranger said, "I did not leave." Harlan felt the stone in his chest shift. He felt the bottom of the well move, and he still did not know what was at the bottom of it. He said, "You were given the road. You were paid to leave." The stranger turned his head and looked at Harlan for the first time. The look lasted 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Harlan Bledsoe understood what every man who had ever stood in front of the stranger eventually understood, which was that the stranger saw everything. He saw the office on the second floor and the desk and the glass of whiskey, and the man who had been sent to call the third man back. He saw it all, and he had been seeing it all along. And the only reason he had left was because he had chosen to leave, and the only reason he had come back was because he had chosen to come back. The stranger said, "You used a man's death to bring him back, a man who walked away from you once, a man who chose silence over complicity. You found the one thing he could not survive having known, and you put it in the street where everyone could hear it." Harlan said nothing. He was a man who always had words. He had built his empire on words, on contracts and signatures and the precise arrangement of language that made other men sign away things they did not know they were signing away. But now he had no words. The stranger said, "Rosario held my arm in the street in El Paso. She was not begging. She was assessing. She had been disappointed too many times to beg. She looked at me and she said, 'They will kill you.' And I said, 'They will try.' That was enough for her. That was the only answer she needed, because she understood something you do not understand, which is that the difference between a man who dies and a man who walks away is not courage. It is not strength. It is the choice to be present when presence costs something." The street was silent. The last light was on Harlan's face, and he could feel it, the heat of it, the way it illuminated everything and hid nothing. The stranger continued. He said, "You think you own this town because you bought it. You think silence is the same as consent. You think a man's name spoken in the street is a chain he will carry forever. But you are wrong about all of it. The name is not mine. It was never mine. I gave it to a woman who asked nothing of me except that I stay alive long enough to leave. She gave it to her son, and now you have spoken it in the street like it was yours to speak. And what you have done is not humiliation. What you have done is something clay does when it decides it has been on the wheel long enough." Harlan's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The stranger said, "Clay does not break when it has been on the wheel too long. Clay breaks when the potter forgets that the clay has its own shape it is trying to become. You shaped me into a story today. You shaped me into a man with a name and a past and a weakness. That is what you do. That is what money does when it has never been told no. But clay does not become what the potter wants. Clay becomes what the clay is. And I am not what you shaped today. I am what I have always been. And what I have always been is the man who was in that street 31 years ago when 4 men wanted to kill a woman for something she had not done. And I stayed, and she lived. And I left before she could thank me, because gratitude is a debt I have never wanted to carry." The stranger's hand moved to his reins. He gathered them slowly. He looked at the horizon one more time, and then he looked at Harlan Bledsoe, and he said the last thing he would say in that town, which was not a threat and was not a promise. It was a fact. He said, "The man whose death you used to bring the third man back will be buried tomorrow in San Angelo. His name was Tomas. He was 26 years old. You know. That is your debt now. Not to me, to him. To the man who walked away and who will carry what you did for the rest of his life. To every person in this town who watched you buy their silence, and who will watch you now not because they are afraid of you, but because they are waiting to see what kind of man you decide to be when the sun comes up tomorrow." He turned his horse. He rode north. The street was empty and the light was gone, and the only sound was the sound of one set of hooves moving away from a town that had been bought and sold, and that had just, for the first time in 40 years, been given something that could not be purchased. Harlan Bledsoe stood on the porch until the stars came out, which in San Pedro in June happened late and all at once, like the sky had been holding its breath. He stood there, and he felt the weight of every name he had spoken in every street he had bought, and the weight of Tomas in a grave in San Angelo, and the weight of the clay, which does not forget the hand that shaped it even when the hand has forgotten the clay. The man who managed his property came back the next morning and found Harlan still on the porch. He had not moved. He had not slept. He had not gone inside. He was holding his gold pocket watch in his hand, open, ticking through 40 years of acquisitions and silences. Harlan said, "Send money to San Angelo for the burial." The man said, "How much?" Harlan closed the watch. He said, "All of it." The man did not ask what that meant. He went inside and wrote the letters, and the town of San Pedro woke up and went about its business and knew that everything had changed. The way towns know things, not with words, but with the quality of silence that settles over a place when a man has passed through it who does not kneel. The stranger rode north until the town was behind him, and the desert opened up and the stars were close enough to touch. He stopped once at a creek to water his horse, and stood there looking at the water over stones, and did not think about Harlan Bledsoe or the name in the street. He thought about a man named Tomas who was 26 and dead because a wealthy man needed something to use. He thought about the way the world arranges itself around the deaths of men who did nothing wrong. He mounted and rode. North was not a direction. North was the only place left. The desert does not forgive weakness, but it does not forgive unnecessary cruelty either. And the difference between the two is not always clear until a man on a gray horse arrives in a town that has been bought and sold and decides, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, that some things cannot be purchased, and some names cannot be used, and some debts can only be paid by the men who incurred them. Harlan Bledsoe paid some of his. In a life measured in acquisitions and silences, some was more than he had ever given before. It was enough to break the wheel.